Hey everyone, I'm Ross Bodine from Alta Physical Therapy and Pilates in Boulder, Colorado. I'm a fellowship-trained physical therapist that specializes in climbers by focusing on the movement system. In other words, I look at how our preferred movement patterns can cause stress and pain in certain structures because anatomical deficits on MRI have poor correlative data as to predicting if that structure is causing pain. As you can see, we have a Grasshopper board here in the clinic, and it has been immensely beneficial in my ability to diagnose and treat climbers' movement dysfunctions. Its symmetrical layout helps me identify preferred movements from side to side that may be contributing to the pain throughout the body. And its adjustable system makes it applicable to everyone. And plus, if you use the code rossb.gh.2022, you can save $500 on their Ninja model. But anyways, I had Neely come in because she was complaining of some forearm pain and wrist pain since her surgery on her right wrist. And I wanted to demonstrate to her and everyone how certain ingrained movement patterns can contribute to pain. Funny enough, she didn't have any pain when she came in, so I started taking her through my movement assessment on the Grasshopper. As I started noticing things, I had her work on correcting it. She struggled with my preferred corrected movement patterns that many other climbers struggle with, and as she resorted back to her movements that she knew, her forearm symptoms started to emerge. So here is our session and what I look for and commonly see in climbers with upper extremity pain. So I started off just trying to get a sense of how she likes to move. She likes to move her hips in, side to side. That elbow moves out as she pulls up compared to that left side pulling straight down. And then on this side, same thing, hips like to move in. Her elbow moves out on that side as well. A little bit more elbow wobble, shaking as she reaches up there. And then breaking it down side to side. Here we can see she readjusts herself on that right hand and still stays pretty still on that left. As she pulls up with that right hand, it moves out to the side and kind of moves in and out a couple times, where she's pretty solid moving and pulling straight down on that left arm. And looking at the next move, pretty symmetrical side to side. She does a better job of keeping that right elbow stationary, more similar to the left. And as she squares up, it looks pretty similar and symmetrical side to side. So nothing too extreme. Ideally, that elbow shouldn't really move out. So here I'm going to kind of just step in and try to correct that a little bit. Yeah, by pulling that elbow straight in. So as she drops down here, I'll have her do it again. And I usually like working on the non-painful side first, just because it's a little bit easier to break a movement pattern, as the painful side is usually locked into a movement that can result in pain. So looking at that right side, that elbow kicks out right away, slowing that down. Looking at that again, that elbow moves out to the side first, and then she remembers to pull that elbow in. As the elbow moves in, her shoulder blade rotates up, and then as she's pulling up again, she loses that position, elbow's kicking out, and that shoulder blade's rotating down. And we'll tune in to see what Neely has to say about it.
I just got into the habit of doing that
Yeah,
when I had surgery.
sure. The latest wrist surgery?
Yeah.
Yeah. Is it better when you're doing that?
It feels more solid.
Cool.
Stronger.
Yeah. You feel your feet a lot more than two?
Yeah.
Pushed in. Cool. Yeah, no issues with the wrist.
No.
Movie on the next one.
I do feel this though.
Okay. Just, does that build? Keep? climbing?
Sometimes it goes away once I'm warm.
Okay.
Sometimes it'll flare up and it'll hurt a lot.
So I'll keep that in mind as we move on to the next assessment. As we change up the moves a little bit further, smaller holds, more Gaston type movement as she's reaching up here.
I felt my forearm on that. So
As you're moving into it?
then I'm moving off of it.
Okay. Let's get a video of that. As we're getting a video with her second attempt, she didn't report any pain. So we're going to break those down side to side and see if there's any differences with those movements. So far, pretty equal. She might be a little bit more bent in the elbows on the right side. So she's staying a little bit higher up. But as she transitions over, it's all pretty equal so far. Then we get to this point where she's pulling up. Pelvis still pretty equal side to side. A little bit more bend in the elbow though. But then here, the pelvis on the right side, her second attempt, lifts up and she's a much more square. She's using her right arm to push her body weight over her left foot. Where on that left side, her toe is in, and that's kind of dumping more of her weight onto her right arm. And then even looking at the feet, her right foot is closer in to the left on her second attempt. So she's, again, weighting that foot better, a little bit less stress on that right arm, and she's staying more vertical. We'll get to what to do about that in a second, but first I just want to see how she normally hangs when training and working her finger strength. The main thing that I see is her elbows are pretty straight with her elbow pits pointing each other. So having straight elbows with your shoulders internally rotating, which causes the elbow pits to face one another, can cause increased stress on that shoulder and wrist. So what I want her to do is I want her to think about lifting the bottom corner of her shoulder blade up towards her elbow in hopes that that would drive that humerus kind of straight down on the scapula and create a little bit more external rotation through the shoulder. So those elbow pits should start to swing around and face us. And let's hear from Neely again.
I feel tricep pain.
Okay.
Here.
Try that again. What what other muscles do you feel yourself using?
My lats and everything kind of.
Anything into the armpit?
Oh yeah.
Kind of closer. Okay. Try to focus on those to create. Now I'm just asking her to start lifting herself up a little bit higher, trying to bend the elbows. And I want that elbow bend to come from the shoulder. I also want that shoulder blade to rotate up more, and the bottom corner will start to push forward into my fingers. But every time she tries to do that, it subtly rotates downward due to her rhomboid dominance. So I'm not really getting anywhere with those cues. I'm going to start asking her to pull her shoulder straight back on the scapula in hopes to engage the rotator cuff a little bit more. And since that is also difficult to do, time for a little demonstration. From here, and then pulling the shoulders kind of straight back into, and it's not the scapula as you're squeezing back, because that kind of pushes my elbows out, kind of straight back. And I'm trying to lift here to there.
Okay.
As I was demonstrating, you could see the bottom corner of my shoulder blade being lifted up towards my elbow as my humerus was getting pulled back on my stable shoulder blade. I'm asking Neely to move this way, not because she needs to move like this every time she's on the wall, but it is an important skill set for climbers to have. Because the more options you have in your quiver of movement patterns, the greater variety of ways that you can actually move on the wall, which will help disperse the stresses that are placed on the upper extremity through a wide variety of tissues rather than centering in on the overused ones. But back to Neely, I'm having her work at a kind of a lower range of motion here because it's easier for her to find that rotator cuff engagement and fullness in the shoulder. So then starting up in that where she can better engage, and then slowly trying to lower down into it and maintaining that engagement. But you can see it's still difficult for her to kind of maintain that fullness in the back of the shoulder. She tends to lose it towards the top there.
Okay. Lots of brain power.
So trying to find a little bit more muscle activation off the wall. Again, we're going to start lower where she finds it a little bit easier, and then we're going to work into that more difficult range. This is called pivot prone. Trying to reach the fingers up towards the ceiling and then rotate them back towards the shoulder, and finding that stability there. Getting that shoulder blade and rotator cuff to really work in conjunction with each other. And my main muscle of interest is serratus anterior, which is easy to find in an overhead position, but more difficult to find down here. Reaching up now, we still want that serratus anterior to stay engaged. We want the rotator cuff to be rotating the elbow pits and palms up towards the ceiling. And with each of these, I'm having her hold them for a minute. And then after a minute, we're going to work on that transition, which you can see is quite difficult for her to do with my very picky critiques of hand positioning. And that's because the shoulder blade largely follows how the palm is facing. So down at the pivot prone low lock-off position, that shoulder blade is hugging itself against the rib cage and tilting backwards, following how those palms are pointing. And up there in the Y positioning, as the palms rotate up, that serratus anterior is able to wrap that shoulder blade around the rib cage. Again, fully upwardly rotating and posterior tilting that shoulder blade. As we move into the reps here, I'll also be asking her to keep her shoulder blade shrugged up towards her ear slightly, and that just helps unlock the humerus on the scapula. Let's see how that translates into hanging.
Just see if you can kind of lift that bottom corner up towards the elbow. Get that elbow to pull down towards it a little bit more. Pull yourself up from there. Just keep your hands up at the shoulder. Good.
Back, like
Yeah,
that.
like that. Then using those muscles to bend.
All of the things that I can't like hurt now. My hip hurts.
From this?
Or maybe from my stomach. I don't know.
Okay.
So something's not quite working right, and we need to take a step back and work on the basics. And you can see there with my resisted wrist extension, as she released, you could see the humerus kind of fell back down into the table. So her rotator cuff isn't stabilizing quite enough, even just for a simple wrist movement. So here I'm asking her to pull her humerus straight back into my fingers, not through the shoulder blade, just by pulling the humerus straight back. And that's all coming from the rotator cuff. If she was to use her posterior deltoid, she would push her elbow into the table and her shoulder would get pushed forward if her rotator cuff wasn't stabilized. And that's just because of where the muscles attach and how the bones and joints are going to rotate. So I'm resisting external rotation initially, and I'm having her hold this for quite a while to really get those muscles to turn on. And then as she's able to find just the shoulder stability, then I am going into more finger stability. Here she has to do a little extra shoulder extension, keeping the rotator cuff engaged, going through each little finger, because as I was testing her strength earlier, that recreated some of her forearm symptoms. I really find this is the best way to deal with weak rotator cuffs rather than doing the usual just stretchy band external rotation. And that's because that exercise really doesn't carry over. Whereas here, I'm asking her to engage the rotator cuff, pulling that shoulder straight back. And then I'm resisting every other motion that the shoulder is responsible for controlling. So now that we've worked on shoulder stability with all different movements of the shoulder, elbow, and wrist and fingers, time to put it all together, try hanging now that that rotator cuff is a little bit more awake, hopefully easier to find. And now as she pulls up, she much more easily pulls that shoulder straight back, and as she does that, her scapula continues to upwardly rotate. So she's finding a much more ideal position in the shoulder right there. And let's take a peek at where she was before. So looking on the right there where she was before, her elbows were straight, pointing each other, and her ears, or her shoulders are actually getting pulled up towards her ears a little bit more. On the left, I'm not asking her to pull her shoulders down and back. I'm asking her to pull the humerus back, and that spreads the shoulders away from one another. From here, what I want Neely to start working on more and more is my favorite on-the-wall training system, which I call movement boarding as opposed to hang boarding, because I want the fingers to the elbow to be a pretty stationary unit, and then the rest of the body moves as a unit around the elbow. So here, that elbow is still out a little bit. I'm asking her to pull it in and keep that shoulder pulled back like we talked about with the hanging. And I really want her to try to keep that shoulder blade stable. So I want her to move the humerus on the shoulder blade, but as she's pulling up into there, that shoulder blade really still likes to pull in closer to her spine. So that rhomboid is working hard and kicking the elbow out a little bit more. On this side, she does a little bit better job keeping that humerus kind of pulling straight in with a more stable scapula. It still likes to pull in a little bit as you see her shoulders kind of shrug up a little bit. Then once she gets the hang of that shoulder, I'm going to start asking her to focus on the pelvis. And she likes to rotate her pelvis to the left every time. So I'm asking her to lift that left hip up and forward and closer to the wall. This will actually help engage the lats a little bit and try to help unlock more of that humerus movement now that the shoulder blade is a little bit more stable. Now that we're tying in the pelvis and the arms in a little bit more, getting more of a squat to occur from the legs. Looking at this side, there's quite a bit more of a rotation to the right with her pelvis as she rotates in there. Her left leg is kind of backstepping a little bit more, so I'm asking her to externally rotate and toe in a little bit harder. As her right arm is on the wall here, she still kind of struggles with letting those knees bend a little bit more. And when I have her focus on one thing, another thing kind of falls apart a little bit. So here I jump in to try to demonstrate how I want her hips and legs to do more of the work. So my legs are pushing up. My right arm is solely focused on keeping me connected to the wall. As you can see, finding the coordination to this new movement pattern is quite difficult. But if she can figure it out, it will create a more robust system that has an option to move in a variety of ways, but help to disperse the stresses across the whole system.